So are there questions so far? Okay, good. That's actually a real book that that's not my kid, but my kids have read it, and it's quite fun. So basic terminology, right? When we talk about Bayes, we talk about two different things usually. One is Bayes' theorem, and the other is the application of Bayesian statistics that relies on Bayes' theorem, but doesn't necessarily bring it to the foreground. The basic idea behind Bayes' theorem, right, is that you can combine different sources of information in order to gain an updated information. Or in other words, that you have some prior information, what you already know, some likelihood, that is what the data tells us, and you can combine them in a relatively straightforward fashion in order to get a posterior inference, right? A posterior estimate, an optimal combination of the prior knowledge with what the data is telling you. So throughout the course, right, we're not going to worry about the mathematical details of Bayes' theorem, but we're going to use these terms: prior, likelihood, and posterior. The prior is our way of setting up in the model what we already know. The likelihood is a way of introducing the data in a form that is compatible with the prior. And the posterior is what the computer, what the algorithm is telling us. That's the optimal combination of the prior information and of the information from the data as it's filtered from the likelihood function. Okay. So first, we should discuss briefly, why do we even care about Bayes? And your answers to the question are basically these four, freely reinterpreted. One is, some of you want to know what the fuzz is about. Some of you have convergence issues in complex models when you're trying to fit them using a frequentist framework. And you've heard that Bayesian statistics is more powerful in avoiding these convergence issues. The third is that you have more flexibility in building models, right? Frequentist statistic is amazing in the sense that there are optimal solutions to very specific problems. And for every time you change the problem, basically, somebody very clever, much more clever than me at least, has found an optimal solution to give you an answer. But that means that you need to have a problem that somebody has already tackled. While in Bayesian statistics, that's not the case, at least most of the time. You can just tell the algorithm what you know about the data and the question that you're asking, and the algorithm, in most cases, at least at a basic level, will find an answer. Finally, some of you have been pushing forth the idea that in traditional statistical framework, you can only test the null and see if it can be rejected. But in the Bayesian framework, you can test any hypothesis, right? You're not constrained to say, well, should we reject the null hypothesis or not? But you can also say, well, how much evidence there is for the fact that my effect size is above 0.2, which is the least minimal effect size that is interesting given what I'm studying. And all of these are good points. What I'm claiming that Bayes is gonna really change the way you're thinking about statistics, or maybe not, it's just giving a more structured way, a more scaffolding to the way you think about statistics, if you're doing it right, is that it gives you a principled way of building your model, right? It forces you to think through what you already know And it forces you to think through with plots the implication of what you think you know, right? To make your undisclosed researcher degrees of freedom disclosed and explicit and tested. The second point for which Bayes is great is that it's very easy to break a Bayesian statistical inference. Your inferences will fail often, and they often fail catastrophically. And that allows you to diagnose your problem instead of having a convergence issue in LME4, which is otherwise a fantastic package. But here you actually have, you can break down the breakdown of the model. You can figure out where it failed and what it means for your problem. And we'll see some examples. Finally, the great thing about Bayesian inference or Bayesian framework is that it scales up, right? You have the same tools and workflow to run t-test, general regression models, but also actual mathematical models of cognitive processing, like reinforcement learning, or mathematical models of theory of mind, or something that is also becoming very popular these days, Bayesian networks, that is the structure of causal inference. It's just exactly the same workflow that we're going to do today. And that's the beauty of Bayes, right? So we just tell the model what we know, and we let it run. It's slow, it fails a lot, but once you get it working, you don't need to learn a new tool just to solve this problem. Of course, you know, with great powers come great responsibilities, right? There's lots of worries when using Bayes. The first one that is often pushed forward by the supporters of alternative frameworks like the likelihood framework or the frequentist framework is that Bayes is very, I should say, Bayesian statistics is very subjective, right? So you need to make a lot of choices, not least what are the priors of your information, of your inference, and that brings a lot of self-doubt. But this is a good thing, right? We're scientists. We make choice already when we design our studies. We make choices when we think how to operationalize a certain measure. And it's our job to sort of make these choices in a more principled and transparent way so that other people can come and help us improve that, or also ourselves in 6 months can come and help us improve the inference. And so assessing choices, for instance, the priors, is part of the process. Right? It's part of the Bayesian inference. And we'll see, key today and tomorrow, the idea of prior predictive checks, of prior posterior update checks and robustness checks that tell us what are the implications of the priors that we've chosen. The second worry that some of you expressed is that Bayesian inference sounds very complex, right? Usually in traditional frameworks like frequentist statistics, you have more or less off-the-shelf packages that do whatever you want. You just need to choose the right one. While in Bayes, you need to build your own model. Right? However, what I would argue is that this complexity is simply because there's transparency. Right? It's not more complex than frequentist statistics. You just have to be more aware of what you are doing. Right? And as I said, frequentist statistics is an amazing intellectual construction, right? If you go and start digging into the theorems and the demonstrations of how these different methods work, it's really impressive. It's just, it's piecemeal. It just takes one problem at a time and finds the optimal solution for that. And then you don't need to worry about what it does, but you need to worry a lot about whether it applies to your problem. Here, the complexity is in a different place, is in forcing you to express the actual knowledge of the problem. And the nice thing about complexity is that it allows the approach to scale up. So you can see in the previous slide, I gave some example. Here, there's a paper that we recently published where we show how you can scale up from the generalized linear model to more explicit knowledge of the excitatory, inhibitory dynamics in social cognition in schizophrenia. The final point that you haven't expressed, but it's something that comes up very often and that you will experience, is that compared to traditional likelihood or frequentist approaches, it takes time. And yes, it does. It takes frustratingly much time, right? Things have gotten much better in the last couple of years, but I still have easily models that take 20 hours to run. So if I make a mistake, I need to rerun it, and that sucks. On the other hand, right, the fact that it takes time has a cognitive advantage, right? It makes you try to be really sure that your work is solid, right? And if you believe that your work is important, right, it's worth taking the time to set it up right and then letting it run 20 hours. I think the only real objection to Bayes that I can think of is climate change, right? Your computer is going to produce a lot of heat, but I think that's already a problem in Micah's lab, right? At least. Okay, so let's go and see in practice, what does these Bayesian stats look like? And we're going to take a specific example. Right. This is vowel hyperarticulation in infant-directed speech. The basic idea is that when adults speak to children, but also pets or second language learners, they tend to over-articulate the speech. They tend to move their articulatory system in a more emphasized way so that the specific sounds are easier to parse and more separate from each other. And one of the plausible theory is that this makes it easier to discriminate and learn infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. You can see on the right a plot that represent 3 extreme vowels in adult-directed speech. So basically, the x-axis is the F2 formant. You don't need to understand the details, but it's basically an expression of where it's articulated in the mouth. On the y-axis, there's the F1. That's another measure of how it's articulated in the mouth. And you can see that the vowels that are pronounced in adult-directed speech form a triangle that is smaller than the one in infant-directed speech, right? But it's just to say that as we look at previous literature, and in particular, there's a systematic meta-analysis by Irena Lovchechik, there are hints that hyperarticulation happens in infant-directed speech across all the languages that have been measured, except maybe Cantonese. But Danish, I belong to a larger project called The Puzzle of Danish, in which we're trying to understand in which ways the peculiar sound structure of Danish, in which consonants are strongly reduced, affects cognitive processing compared to other languages which are very similar, but pronouncing consonants like Norwegian bokmål. And so what we find is that every time we look at some linguistic phenomenon in Danish, Danish is odd. Right? We know that Danish has an obnoxious number of vocalic and semivocalic sounds. Depending on who you ask, it's up to 60 different sounds. While Norwegian, at least in the dominant dialect, has something like, now I don't remember the exact number, but something like 18, right, Chris? So why should Danish, that goes out of its way to make these obnoxious number of vowels, make it easy on children to learn it? Right? We know that Danish is kind of difficult to parse. And indeed, there's some research that points to the fact that Danish or native Danish speakers do not hyperarticulate infant-directed speech. there's a paper by Okebone, that's Fusaroli University, where it shows that while Danes tend to speak slower and a bit more lively when speaking to their children, they don't hyperarticulate. They don't make it easier to learn the vowels. And a follow-up by one of my PhD students, Christina Didriksen, took this very controlled study that Oke did in the lab in a soundproof booth with parents being instructed about what to say, and recorded parents and children in naturalistic situation, and actually found the pretty impressive result that, if anything, native speakers of Danish articulate less when they're speaking to their children compared to when they're speaking to adults, right? So the idea that actually they're, and now I'm speculating, they're adopting a swim or drown kind of approach, right? It's a bit more complex, but this is for the fun of the example, right? Well, I'm making it even more difficult. You got to learn it. Right? So this is, of course, surprising, and surprising claims require outstanding evidence, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze a new data set, which is a follow-up to the Didriksen study made by Didriksen herself, where the data has been pre-processed by Chris here, where we have 24 mothers that are speaking for 30 minutes to their child at home during a free interaction, and at a different point in time, but in the same day, to a research assistant, which means that we have 2 data points per mother, one where they're speaking to the child, one where they're speaking to the research assistant. And Chris will share the data once we get to the exercise. We are then going to model vowel articulation, so how big that triangle is, as the simple possible model, simply as a Gaussian distribution. It feels silly, but we need to build things step by step to understand what's going on. Right? We need to learn to play with priors and likelihood. We're then gonna say that the mean of this Gaussian distribution, right, is not one mean, but is a linear model, is determined by whether the mother is speaking to a child or to an adult, that is by register. We add a dichotomous predictor to the mu, to the mean of the Gaussian distribution. We're then going to include the repeated measures, the fact that each mother has 2 data points, and worry about how do we think about the relation between the population level estimate, the difference between ADS and IDS in the population, and the same difference in each individual. And finally, we're going to include informed priors. So we're going to scour the previous literature and actually build priors from those results, include them in the model, and see how do we deal with that, and how do we deal with the feeling that maybe we're affecting the inference too much by doing so. We're not ever free from the past, right? We want to learn from the past, but we want to do that in a critical way.